I'm going to jump around a bit in this chapter from how the textbooks got it organized, because I want to show you how different things are connected with each other, different passages. So let's start out with clarifying terms. Antebellum, before the war, and then evangelicals, we've already talked about who those are. And revivalism and reform are two main components of evangelical culture. And these, like the book is saying, these not only shape the lives of evangelicals themselves, but it becomes part of the American character. So these are the people that when other people look at America and talk about those Americans, these are the ones that they're taking as the emblems around the time of the early 1800s through the Civil War. And you can say that they had a common set of assumptions. These all had to do with creating a Christian America in which that culture would be the dominant one. So your book talks about theology, and I'm going to come back to that. I want to skip over that for a moment. And I also want to skip over some of the discussions of the common sense philosophy and some of the other issues here. And I want to jump into the discussion about higher education. So, oops. Yeah, who's with these things? What we're engaged in right now, higher education. This played a major role in this development of evangelical culture. We've talked about this a little bit before. The Ivy League schools, most of them start out as religious schools. They're founded by particular denominations to articulate and to train people in that particular denomination's way of seeing things. Your book runs through all sorts of other schools. The Ivy League, they're the early ones. They're the ones who supply the administrators for later schools. Your book runs through a whole bunch of different, we might say, second-tier schools. I'm not making a judgment on whether they're second-tier now, but at the time they would have been. Like Denison or Oberlin, Ohio Wesleyan, Worcester. All of these are actually started by Protestants, and they're intended to be Protestant schools. Your book talks about capstone classes. How many of you are seniors right now? Are any of you seniors? Okay. How many are juniors? So you seniors, you're already thinking about or working on your capstone, right? And you juniors, do you have an idea what you're going to do for your capstone in your major? No idea? Some idea? What is a capstone class supposed to do? Other than be some impediment that you got to get through to get your degree and get out of here and get on with your career. What's the actual purpose of it? Maybe supply a professor some reason to indulge their area of research. It's supposed to tie everything together, right? A capstone in a building is the stone that connects everything else. Like in an arch, it's the one that holds the arch together. So it's supposed to be the class that's bringing together everything that you've studied and helping you to synthesize that material. Your book talks about who actually used to teach these capstone classes. It was the president of the university. So imagine that your capstone class is with Dennis Murray instead of with whoever is going to be your professor with this. And you know what the capstone class would be is moral philosophy. And usually that would not just be an ethics class like the one that you've taken already here at Marist. It would be much more religious in nature. It would tie together theology and ethics. Higher ed was closely tied in with religion, not just in the founding of these schools, but in the very structure of the curriculum. It was putting across this kind of viewpoint. And it wasn't just higher ed, it was also what we nowadays call primary and secondary education. These were felt to be particularly important not only in order to have an educated public, which you need for a democracy, but also for religious reasons. If you want people to be able to read the Bible, they actually have to be able to read, right? If you want them to be able to make decisions for themselves about what their devotional life should look like, they have to be able to not only read, but be able to make sense out of what they're reading. They have to develop the skills that we nowadays call critical thinking or content analysis, those sorts of things. And your book talks about this in terms of literacy, and it talks about an entire literature that was popular at that time. Not just the King James Bible, but also the Fox's Acts of, or the Book of Martyrs, John Bunyan's Pilgrim Progress, Richard Baxter's The Saints' Everlasting Rest, and all these hymns by Isaac Watts and Charles Wesley. These are not books that we read much anymore today. But they were part of a literature that educated people at that time were all intimately familiar with. They were devotional literature that people would use to make sense out of their religious life. So, in the primary or secondary schools, part of the goal was to enable people to be able to make sense out of things. And, like your book points out, this education was publicly supported. We're talking about a public school system. The common schools could serve as a conduit for non-denominational moral training. So I'm actually going to put that term up there. Non-denominational moral training. So non-denominational, that means it's not tied to any particular church. If you go to a non-denominational church, you'll ask, are you a Baptist, a Methodist? They'll say, we're non-denominational. We don't actually take a stand on that sort of thing. We just read the Bible. Or we just, pray or do this sort of thing. And moral training means being trained in a certain way of understanding right and wrong. What we often do call ethics, right? So that's part of what they were doing in school. That was as important as reading and writing and arithmetic. You could say that R, religion, was the fourth R involved in that. But a sort of just general Protestantism. Like your book points out, they did use the King James textbook for readings, and that didn't go over too well with Jews or Catholics or non-Christians or atheists, deists. They were not that big on that. But it took a while before that was sort of rooted out. So all of this is part of what's going on. There's another form of education that your book talks about as well. The entire Sunday school movement, which originally starts out as a way to reach the poor and evangelize the working class, the laborers, on a day when usually they're going to have off, becomes a way to carry out this kind of moral education among the middle class, among Protestants. So there's like I said, a vast instructional literature that develops out of this, and you've got all these things connected with each other. Who are providing the teachers? Who are providing the Sunday school teachers? Quite often, the universities or colleges have a role in that. These are connected with each other. All of this is sort of a vast network where there's no one single point that you can point to and say, aha, somebody made a decision and everybody else is following that decision. Instead, it's more like there's all these different ways to be a Christian, provided you stay within certain boundaries. Don't be a Catholic, don't be, later on a Latter-day Saint or things like that. But so long as you remain within this set of boundaries, you're fairly free to do what you want. Your book also talks about the family home as being sort of a shrine, a domestic shrine, and the role of middle-class women. In the 19th century, you see these developments that take place that are really quite not unique, because it's happening also in England and in Germany, but it's not happening everywhere else. And Women, I think you've all heard this status. They're either like placed on a pedestal, or they're cast into the abyss. Either they're like the chaste goddess of the home, or they're the streetwalker. That was sort of a common portrayal in the 19th century. If you read 19th century literature. In part that was taking place because for middle class women there wasn't a lot of engagement in the marketplace. There wasn't a lot of engagement in the world of work and commerce outside of the home. And so they wind up, like your book says, isolated with their children in genteel neighborhoods, far removed from the cities. And a new cult of domesticity or true womanhood begins to emerge among American Protestants, and it influences Catholics to some extent. So what does this take place in terms of? Your book talks about samplers, bookmarks, Bibles, pincushions. You know what we call these things these days, except for the Bibles? Knickknacks or kitsch. You can still find them in some old homes. But for the most part, you're probably not going to decorate your house with the kind of stuff that 19th century antebellum evangelicals found to be completely essential. These were the things that everybody who was civilized would have. Like it says, the mother was primarily responsible for the maintenance and decoration of the home, as well as the moral and religious nurture of the children. So they talk about this in terms of domestic piety, and that's a central idea. So notice all the things that are tied in with culture. We've got education, we've got the home. Now we want to look at the actual religious practice and beliefs that are tied in with this. So we want to look at theology and worship. And let's actually start with worship. We're going to use this term low church, which is usually used about Anglicans, but it makes sense to use it in terms of this. Low church or evangelical worship is going to be less liturgical, more oriented towards devotion, towards preaching of the gospel, or preaching of the preaching coming out of the Bible, right? Applying biblical verses to particular circumstances. And it's going to be, in certain respects, less structured. So revival preaching would be sort of like at an extreme of this. With a revival, you don't have any sort of liturgy going on as a necessary part of it. You have this incredible effort to awaken enthusiasm in people. But like we've seen, revivals, they don't last that long. They don't produce lasting effects that can be continued. Instead, what's needed is some sort of pattern. And the pattern involves what? What are the basic elements of evangelical church services? So there's prayer. And your book talks about this as occasional. They don't mean occasional in the sense of like every once in a while they would pray, because they were praying every time they'd have a service. Instead, it means that people would compose prayers for the occasion, and sometimes they would recycle these. They weren't being all made up on the spot spontaneously. These could become very dramatic, singing. And, this is something that we kind of take for granted. Most church services that you go to in the United States today, there's going to be a music minister, and there'll be a lot of singing, because people like to sing. And there's a lot of jokes about who sings well and who doesn't sing well. If you want to hear good singing, for instance, go to a Baptist church. If you want to hear mumbling along with it, maybe go to a Catholic church, or unless it's one that really likes to sing. There's all sorts of jokes about these sorts of things, right? But everybody does tend to have singing. As a matter of fact, some of the newer churches, that may be the centerpiece of the service. That's a pretty new thing. For liturgical churches, they had music. But a lot of the radical Reformation churches, they narrowly restricted the kind of singing and the occasions in which it would take place. Remember with the Calvinists, it should all be psalms, and they resisted any sort of songs that would not be coming out of the Bible. So this is something quite different. All sorts of singing is taking place. There's like a gathering body of traditional, by this time, traditional songs that people would sing. Think about, for example, Amazing Grace. All of you could probably sing the first verse of Amazing Grace, whether you're a religious believer or not, right? Because you've heard it so many times. You can at least hum it, I think. You might mumble some of the words. I bet you probably know that more likely than knowing all the words to the national anthem. Because Amazing Grace is still kind of a more prevalent song. That was a new song at one point, and then it became part of a repertoire. And, you know, if you do these things over and over and over again, it becomes kind of a habit. Preaching, another central part of the worship. And what is all of this tied to? Well, there's a few main things that they're focusing on in this chapter that tie in with this reforming impulse. And here now we're starting to talk about the theology. Remember, we began at the beginning of the semester talking about what is theology. It's the more organized, more academic way in which people make sense out of what's going on in their religious tradition. It provides you with some of the whys, some of the deeper meanings of things. You wouldn't necessarily have to do theology to go to church, but somebody's doing theology. Somebody's providing explanations. So the theology, there's sort of a spectrum between Calvinism and Arminianism. Which being John Wesley. And then there's like this third way, theology. And your book talks about it in terms of these two very important evangelical figures who were talked about in previous chapters, but I didn't go into much. Charles Finney and Lyman Beecher. And then this guy, Horace Bushnell. And Bushnell, he's being influenced by the Romantic movement. That won't make that much sense to you unless you know your literature and philosophy. He was working to undermine revivalism through his downplaying of the boundaries between the divine and the human and the promotion of the idea of Christian nurture. So what does this mean when they're saying that in the textbook? He's starting to develop a theology where, unlike Calvinism, where people are fallen and you can sort of strictly divide the saved from the damned, and God really doesn't have that much to do with the distorted culture in which we live. With this notion, the difference between the secular and the profane, the sacred, the holy, and the everyday starts to break down. And a new idea starts to come on the scene. And he's not the only person to articulate it. There's a word that we associate with this that's particularly important in theology. It's a long one. Post-Millennialism. Post means after, right? You guys all know that. But what's millennialism? Well, what is the millennia? Let's start with that. What's a millennia? What does that mean? Anytime you've got that mill prefix, what should you think in terms of? Give you a hint, it's composed of centuries. Put 10 of them together and you got what? Yeah, so we're talking about thousands of years. Now, why does anyone care about that? Well, because in the apocalyptic literature in the Bible, so we're talking about the books that are kind of murky and often seem to be about prophecies, and people get into all sorts of arguments about. There is a discussion about the second coming of Christ. And This was something that was very important for early Christians, and it was very important for other Christians. And when you get to like 1,000-year mark, like when it came to AD 1000, people went crazy. And a lot of people were expecting, the second coming, and they would do things like sell all their possessions and just, wait around. And we're going to talk about some other millennial movements a bit later on. Now, with some of the ways in which this is understood, what's called premillennialism, there's this notion that the second coming is going to come, is going to happen. Coming is going to come, that's kind of silly. The second coming is going to happen, and it's going to be preceded by all sorts of terrible things happening, usually drawn from the book of Revelation. So there's a lot of discussions about exactly what's going to happen, who's going to be saved, and who's going to be damned. Sometimes discussions of the rapture get all rolled into this as well, which, by the way, is coming from a Pauline letter, if I remember right, Thessalonians. And this premillennialism has this view that things are going to have to go to crap before anything gets better. Post-millennialism is sort of the opposite. The view is that we're already in the new age, and through human efforts, I'll put it to you like this. Humanity can bring about something like heaven on earth. As a matter of fact, not only should humanity do that, or can humanity do that, humanity should do that. That the 1,000-year kingdom that's being described in the book of Revelation would unfold gradually through step-by-step improvement, through progress. So, think about, just for example, material existence. Let's leave religion out of it altogether. Have human lives gotten longer and longer over the last 200 years? Why? Hopefully. I don't know that that's actually true. I think there's some studies that show that remains about constant. But we're certainly living differently. What are some of, I guess you could say we're living smarter. What are some of the ways in which we're living smarter than say, our ancestors were? I'll give you one really crazy example. My grandfather, when he was a kid, they made him gargle with kerosene when he got sick. Now, that can't be good for you. It might cure the cold, but it's going to kill a hell of a lot more, isn't it? And stuff like that was kind of common. It's not surprising they didn't live as long. We know more about what you should and shouldn't do. I hesitate to say that we're smarter because we often don't put it into practice. But we've gotten rid of a lot of diseases, right? Nowadays, people die of old people's diseases for the most part, like heart disease, cancer. Back in the day, you'd die of tuberculosis or malaria, and you could die pretty young from that. And we've changed that. We do still have a lot of people living in poverty, but is poverty today, for the most part, the same as poverty was 100 years ago? There weren't any poor people 100 years ago who had TV, or who had a car. You could still be living hand to mouth, but a lot of people are living in rather better circumstances than before. So that would be one example of bringing about this heaven on earth. We're not there yet, right? But that would be something that they would be driving at. So that's a major part of this entire, to bring it up again, this term of the benevolent empire. It tended to be aimed at this notion that through progress we would make the world into a better and better place. And that was a religious expression and a religious requirement. Again, something that you're finding in Protestant Christianity, Evangelical Christianity, before the Civil War. So your book talks about how all these things are coordinated together. And here's where we actually get to the question about Catholics that I put off a little bit. Your book also mentions that if you're going to have some sort of drama like this, you got to have good guys and bad guys. So if you're the Protestants, then who's going to be the bad guys? Not the Jews, because there aren't many of them, and they're not really doing anything. There was a lot of anti-Catholicism that was wrapped up in this. And as a matter of fact, some of the very documents that your book talks about, later on they used the same stuff from those documents and just changed the names a little bit, and that became anti-Mormon literature. Anti-Catholic literature became anti-Mormon literature. And why? Well, because you need some sort of enemy or agent of evil to point at, and that's part of what they talked about here. Evil did not exist as an abstract force, but in the very worldly personifications. They also talk about the slaveocracy. That meant the sort of southern regime of justifying slavery and using human capital, essentially, just using it up over and over again, using human beings merely as tools. But there was a lot of what they're talking about as anti-Catholicism. You can read about the literature in that. Almost all of that literature turns out to be based on fiction. But it became very popular. There's a book, by the way, which I recommend to you if you're interested in this sort of thing, called The Protestant Crusade, which is about precisely that kind of literature. So who would this be? Liturgical Protestants are mainly two groups, the Anglicans and the Lutherans. Remember we called them at the beginning the Conservative Reformation? Why were they conservative? Because they held on to the liturgy. This is why you can go to a Roman Catholic church and a Episcopal church or a continuing Anglican church and a Lutheran church, and you're going to see a lot of similarities between what they're doing at the services. As a matter of fact, they may be singing some of the same songs because they share a lot of those in common with each other. They're all focused on liturgy. So these are the Protestants that, opposed to evangelicals, thought that the way the service is conducted needed to be retained. And they're focused on liturgy, and to be focused on liturgy also means to be focused on sacraments. That sets them apart from other Protestants quite a bit. There's also some other factors that are setting these guys apart from other Protestants as well. So they're not fitting in quite as well as, say, Presbyterians or Methodists. In the case of the Anglicans, it has to do with who's in charge. The Anglicans, they're the Church of England, right? So in the American Revolution, who's the American Revolution against? England, and specifically the king, right? The king is the head of the Anglican Church. So if you're in America and they're having a revolution against the king, who's actually the head of your church, you're kind of in a pickle, aren't you? And as a matter of fact, quite a few of the Anglicans fought against the revolutionaries. They were part of the Tory militia, who were particularly strong in the South, where Anglicans were found. That did not endear them too well to other Americans. And they were looked at as being kind of suspect. That's why they ended up changing their name from Anglicans to Episcopalians. And they also sort of broke ties and said the head of the English church is no longer the head of the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States. Before the Revolution, they were, in a certain respect, the, in theory, dominant religious group in the United States, but they really weren't dominant. They were just sort of at the top as far as class went, and they weren't that influential except in mostly the southern colonies. That's what chapter 12 talks about. And there was a lot of resistance to them, even before the Revolution. As things got closer and closer to the outbreak of hostilities, Anglicans were looked at as being kind of like, do you guys know the term fifth column? It's when you have enemies inside your own country. People really who espouse the same cause as your enemies living next door to you. That's the way a lot of people started looking at Anglicans, the people who were going to become Episcopalians. With Lutherans, it was a different set of issues. With Lutherans, it had to do with ethnicity. Where was Martin Luther to start with? Do you remember that? Where does he nail the I'm not talking about like a specific town, just what country. Where does he nail up the 95 Theses?
Saxony?
Yeah, and now Saxony was part of Germany, right? So a lot of ethnic Germans are Lutherans. And then it spreads further north into Scandinavia. So we're talking about, also it does go east to the Baltic states as well, but not too many of them emigrated. So when we're thinking about Lutherans in the United States, we're thinking about Germans, Swedes, Danes, and Norwegians. I suppose you could say some Icelanders as well, but there's not a lot of emigration from there. And they end up settling partly in places like New York, for example, once they're allowed to. But they also end up settling further out. Many of them end up on the frontier. Remember when we looked at those maps at the beginning of the semester? Where are the Lutherans? Where's the big presence of them today? Minnesota is a huge Lutheran presence. Lots of parts of Wisconsin, Iowa to some degree, the Dakotas. That's where you see a lot of Lutheran presence. Why? Well, that's where those people settled. And when they settled there, like a lot of immigrants, what are some of the big problems for immigrants, besides people not liking immigrants? What are some of the issues that they tend to bring with them? What are some of the challenges that they face to assimilating to the larger culture?
Establishing themselves.
So becoming successful enough to be not just be a laborer or something like that. Yeah. What else?
A language barrier.
That's a huge one, and those kind of go together. Language and culture. Before the, we're sort of jumping far ahead. Before World War I, there were just huge amounts of German immigrants who had never bothered to learn English because they didn't have to. Because you could live in areas where everybody spoke German. There were parts of Chicago like that, actually. I knew a woman who grew up in Little Italy. This was only about 70 years ago. She didn't actually know that the rest of the world wasn't Italian until she got to a certain age and moved out of that neighborhood and got a job and found out there were other people besides Italians because everybody spoke Italian and they had their own movie theaters and their own grocery stores. And it was that way for a lot of Germans. World War I changed that because the Germans actually not only fought against us, but had a spy ring in the United States, and that ticked off Americans so much that they started forcibly requiring assimilation. The school that I went to as an undergrad, up until 1923, all the classes were in German. That was a college. After that, they switched to English. So if you're going to do that, you're not going to blend in very well, are you? You're not going to become part of the larger culture. And the larger culture was white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, this evangelical culture of the benevolent empire that we were talking about for a while. So Episcopalians and Lutherans are somewhat in the same boat. They're not fitting in that well. They're both Protestants, but they're not really in the evangelical spectrum. There's some tensions that take place having to do with how much to assimilate to evangelical practices. So your book talks about, we'll use this term low church, and we'll use it for both Anglicans and for Lutherans, even though it's not really appropriate for both. We're a little short on time, so I'm not going to go into the whole question here about, the Eastern Lutherans or stuff like that. We can use this term low church, which meant to have an evangelical emphasis. There's a lot of tensions because some Lutherans wanted to fit in better. They said, I kind of like what these other, Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians are doing. Some of the Episcopalians, especially in the South, were doing that as well. This led to breakups. This led to splits. There is a Southern Episcopal church that's split off. That's much more low church. There are Lutheran churches, most of which didn't actually survive as holding on to any of their parishioners for very long, but they did the same sort of thing. So where we see groups like the Missouri Synod coming in are the ones that are favoring this, the traditional identity. And what else do we need to say about this very quickly? Some of this we can probably put off till a later class. Along with the opposite of the low church movement would be a high church movement, at least for the Episcopalians. That's associated with what we call the Oxford movement. But we'll look at that in a later chapter. So this is enough for right now.